Thank you so much for your patience. I really, really appreciate it. I want to thank all of you, both on Zoom and especially here live and in person, for attending today. I know there was a little bit of a dodgy weather pattern this morning, so I'm especially grateful for all of you to be here in person. I want to begin by noting that this panel is being recorded. So every Rappaport Center program is unique. And so like my children, I'm not supposed to say that I have a favorite. But this one is uniquely special because it is an opportunity that is quite rare for us to turn the spotlight on someone who usually serves our center with very little pomp and circumstance. Professor Pat McCoy is, for the last 2 months, the faculty director of our center, and we're incredibly grateful for her support and her leadership after serving quite a long time on our advisory board as well. So when she's not teaching students here at BC Law or supporting the center, Professor McCoy has a really interesting, well, she's kind of an overachiever in a variety of other domains. Fun fact that you may not know, she is a very excellent singer, having performed choral works and operas with some major orchestras. And when that's not taking enough of her time, she decided to write a book. So Professor McCoy's book, Sharing Risk, The Path to Economic Well-Being for All, begins with the reality that for over the past century, we have shifted more and more economic risk to individuals. And that reality is even more stark in this particular moment, which is why I was really curious, as the New York Times noted this morning, that when for months polls have shown that economic concerns really dominate voters' thinking, in the State of the Union, only roughly 10 minutes of the 107-minute speech was devoted to economic issues. And that disjunction, that disconnect between what people are experiencing in their lives on a daily basis and how our federal government is responding, that seems particularly interesting, and why this fireside chat is so timely. So today we are here to explore not only the reality of what people are experiencing, but also the question of who bears the risk when systems fail. But most importantly, we are here to think about what kind of society we should be building instead, which is why I'm delighted to introduce you to two builders. And I'm going to keep my introductions of these two luminaries quite short and give them an opportunity to say a little bit about themselves as well. But just as a formality, let me introduce you to these two outstanding speakers we have today. The first, Professor McCoy, is the inaugural Liberty Mutual Insurance Professor and the faculty director for the Rappaport Center. She's a nationally prominent scholar in financial regulation. And her most recent book, let me take a chance to try again, is just one of 4 books that she's written. In 2010 and 2011, Professor McCoy joined the U.S. Department of Treasury, where she was recruited by Senator Elizabeth Warren to help form the new Consumer Financial Protection Bureau. And she oversaw the Bureau's mortgage policy initiatives as CFPB's first head of mortgage markets. She's devoted her career to thinking about how to strengthen and modernize the way we share risk. That brings us to our second guest, whose career embodies what it looks like to lead through risk. Kim Janey made history when she was sworn in as Boston's first woman and first black mayor, successfully leading the city through a multitude of challenges, including the pandemic. She was also a Boston City Councilor and served as its president. One of my favorite stories about her time in office actually has nothing to do with titles. When Mayor Janey stepped into the mayor's role after Marty Walsh became the Secretary of Labor, some took to calling her the acting mayor. And she was very clear. She was not acting, she was doing. Doing, not acting, that's probably one of my favorite phrases of all time. And that phrase has really stayed with me because it reflects a really quiet but powerful truth about leadership. It's not about posture, it's not about performance. It is about responsibility, governing with urgency and with care, particularly when communities are facing layered vulnerabilities as they were when Mayor Janey was in office. Today, as President and CEO of Economic Mobility Pathways, or EMPath, Mayor Janey continues that work. She served also as a spring 2022 resident fellow at the Institute of Politics at the Kennedy School, and also as a 2023 Ascended Fellow at the Aspen Institute. So please join me in welcoming both Professor McCoy and also Mayor Janey. So I'm going to begin by just asking Professor McCoy, in addition to saying something else about yourself, please tell us what you argue in your book. Share with us a little bit about the major arguments we should be aware of.
Thank you so much, and thank you for that gracious introduction, Amanda. I'll only mention two other aspects of my background that came together in this book. First of all, as you all know, I've been on the BC Law faculty for now going on 12 years. And one of our big themes here at BC Law School is the common good. And that is a goal that infuses this entire book. The other thing I'll mention about my background is I used to teach at the University of Connecticut School of Law. This should be better.
There we go.
Thank you so much. Thank you for the reminder. I used to teach at the University of Connecticut School of Law, where I headed the Insurance Law Center. Insurance law concepts are a big part of my policy recommendations in this book. And so that's the other relevant part of my background. As you know, today we are here in part to discuss my new book. I'll plug it shamelessly. It's called Sharing Risk, The Path to Economic Well-Being for All. I am especially honored to be discussing it with our own Boston Mayor, Kim Janey. Nobody has more insight into the problems that the book discusses than she. And I have to say, when Mayor Janey was sworn into office in 2021, it was so inspiring, and my heart went out to her because it was the middle of COVID. This is somebody who proved herself under crisis conditions, and for her to take the time to join us here today is very special. So welcome to Boston College Law School. Thank you. So let me provide a really short thumbnail sketch of the book. We all know that the topic of affordability is dominating the headlines. But there's a flip side to the affordability debate. And it has to do with the statistic that really was the inspiration for the book. Today, half of American families, the bottom 50%, doesn't have enough income to cover their basic needs. Now, I'm not talking about streaming subscriptions. I'm not talking about cell phone plans. I'm talking about having just enough money to pay for rent, to pay for food, and to pay for shelter, for the most basic necessities of life. So rising costs are not the only challenge that families face. A lack of sufficient income is a problem as well. How did we get here? This problem has gotten worse over the past 50 years. In the past half century, high-paid manufacturing jobs have vanished, and unionization has sharply declined. Wages for most workers have stagnated as a result. For low-wage workers, the buying power of their income today is actually less than it was in 1970. For middle-income workers, it's no better. It's not worse, but it's no better. But that's not all. On top of that, families bear more financial risk than they did 50 years ago. If they lose their jobs, fewer of them qualify for unemployment insurance than 50 years ago. They have less security when they face retirement. They have to pay much more to send their kids to school than when I went. When I went to law school, my entire law school tuition for 3 years was $1,500. Okay, I know this is ruining your lunch. So we obviously don't have that situation today, and so that risk falls on families. As a result, the bottom half lacks enough income to live on, yet they face more financial risk than their parents or their grandparents did. And I submit that this problem has become so widespread that it now threatens the political stability of the United States. It's part of the explanation for the turbulence that we're living in now. U.S. policymakers tell these families either you should save money or go into debt if you have cash flow problems. Saving large sums of money is not realistic for these families, however, because they don't have discretionary income to save. Debt, as I think we all understand, usually makes their financial problems worse. So I call for a different approach, which is expanded risk-sharing programs. Another word for this is social insurance, that would do two things. It would shore up family incomes, and it would take some of these heavy financial risks that now individual families are staggering under and shift them back to the federal government. Examples of my proposals would include raising the minimum wage so that families have a true living income, better unemployment insurance, and targeted support for college, retirement, and health insurance. My goal is to allow families to aspire, if they wish, to 5 basic financial goals: to just getting through the month, to buying a home if they want to staying healthy, attending college if they want their kids to go to college, and having a secure retirement. So with that, let me now turn the floor over to Mayor Rainey.
Hello, can you hear me okay?
We can.
Wonderful. Good afternoon. It is a pleasure to be here with you, Professor. I want to thank Amanda, and I want to thank all of the organizers of this event, all of you for being here. A special shout out to my friend in the back there, Justice Hines. I think I see you back there. Just a delight to be here. My name is Kim Janey. I am the President and CEO of Economic Mobility Pathways. It is a national nonprofit concerned deeply about economic mobility, addressing the racial wealth gaps, helping families climb the economic ladder, and really breaking intergenerational poverty. It is a delight to be here. And Amanda, I want to thank you for remarking on something that I don't know a lot of people know. You must have encountered my Twitter handle at some point. And there was a lot to say at that time about titles and how much power I would have in this role. And what I found to be true is I had the power to do everything that I needed to do in that moment. I would often quote Alice Walker, who said, the biggest way that people give up their power is by thinking they don't have any. And when I think about the thousands, tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands of people that we help stay in their homes through rental assistance and investing there, the people who we helped get vaccinated and stop the death toll that was ravaging certain communities in Boston and not others because of inequities that have existed for centuries. Those families were not concerned about titles. They were grateful to get the support. And many were so vulnerable at that time because of what Professor points out, that so many folks do not have what they need in terms of just their basic needs. At EMPath, we get to address that work. I am very pleased and proud to represent an incredible organization. I am joined today by my colleague, Kathy. Thank you so much for being here, Kathy. You know, our work really centers individuals who are experiencing poverty. It centers them as the driver, as the person who knows best what is best for them. We have a breakthrough coaching approach that has seen a lot of success. We are testing that coaching approach with a randomized controlled trial. We have a global learning network that has over 1,000 organizations worldwide, including 11 international countries, that are using our approach and seeing similar success in their home communities. We do research to understand what is working, which is why your book is so helpful. And we also do the public policy systemic change work, because these issues can all be traced back to policy decisions. And so if we are going to address them, if we are going to have recommendations that work and help American families, we need to make sure we are also doing so at the local, state, and national level in terms of public policy. That is the work that I am privileged to do every single day with colleagues at EMPath. We are a nonprofit based here that is over 200 years old, and for most of that history, we have been really focused on supporting and strengthening women and families, and I'm really proud of this history and the work that we are doing. So thank you again for having me, and I'm so excited for the conversation.
Thank you both. Not just looking into your Twitter, I'm obsessed with it. So, Professor McCoy, your book argues that the solution lies in large-scale structural reforms coming from the policy level and driven by the government. And Mayor Janey, both your leadership at the city and also at MCAS seem to focus more on community empowerment. And certainly at MCAS, a more kind of direct and relational mode of change. So I'm curious from both of you, where do you see the path of security for families? Is it through policy reform at the federal or state level, or through local innovation and community-based change and design? What are the strengths and limitations of each of those approaches, according in your thinking? And also, might there be room to bring these two approaches together? And let me begin with Mayor Janey.
Great. Thank you. I would say and both, and I would say that EMPath uses an and both. While we are very much grounded in our local work in community building relationships, that is important to build that trust. Our coaches that work with families, with individuals, that close relationship is really important to the success of our families as they climb the economic ladder. That being said, it is also important to make sure we are addressing the systemic structural issues that trap so many families into poverty. Long before I ran for public office, my origin story is really grounded in community organizing. Back in the 1990s, became a community organizer and understood through that work that many of the things that we were fighting to change required some sort of policy lever. And you can do the work, certainly as an advocate, as an organizer, as someone who is working in community, and you can also decide that you are going to go into what some have called the belly of the beast to try to change things from the inside. I did both of those things and bring both of those lenses to the work at EMPath. And so I believe strongly in the and both approach, grounding ourselves in community, building those relationships, understanding what is working, what families say they need, what the barriers are, so that we can address it. And then making sure we are pushing every single lever at our disposal to help families climb the economic ladder. And often those are the systemic public policy at the local or national level.
I too believe that it requires both, and hopefully in partnership.
Yes.
So today, sometimes that's more aspirational than actual. The reason in my book I focus more on federal policy is that I'm trying to free up more financial resources for families. And the way that I do this is through social insurance programs that turn out to be easier for the federal government to sponsor and host. One of the reasons is that the federal government is able to build bigger pools that allow greater diversification of risk along greater across state lines. The federal government can provide these programs nationwide, so we don't have a situation where some states do not have programs and other states do. I think that's a rank inequity. The federal programs can address problems nationwide. And the federal government also has some special powers that allows it to underwrite risks over decades. That's very difficult for a local government or state government to do because state and local governments every year have to balance their budgets. Now, in this room, we all know that Uncle Sam does not necessarily have to balance his budget, and that is an important consideration. But the federal government cannot be put into receivership, and so it has the ability to bear more risk than state or local governments. And it has the ability to raise money to fund these programs. At the same time, the federal government needs to have humility. I was a bureaucrat in Washington, and I know the feeling of being in a conference room with other bureaucrats where we're trying to come up with federal policy and we think we know best. No. The federal government needs to go out into communities. It needs to meet with people on the ground. It needs to meet with Mayor Janey. It needs to meet with the clients of EMPath and find out what they need, what are their real life needs, and learn from that, be guided by that. So I think it's essential to have that partnership.
Absolutely. Absolutely.
I'm curious if you don't mind my follow-up. In working with your clients at EMPath, what are some of the surprising things that they might have to share with policymakers about household precarity? So just taking up the question that Professor McCoy just invited us to take up, right? Which is like, what would we hear from those who are traditionally not at the table in this conversation?
Great question. Sadly, so many families have to make tough choices. Perhaps declining an opportunity for a new job because it will put their income outside of the qualifications for their housing subsidy or their child care subsidy. And so wouldn't it be great to take this new opportunity, take on this new job? It's in the career path that you would want to, but because of that extra income, now you risk losing essential benefits that make it possible for you to meet your basic needs. That is one trade-off. It could be a trade-off between paying bills. Any little crisis can set someone into a downward spiral. The car breaks down. A winter snowstorm where you are plowed in and can't get your car out to get to work. Anything can have such an impact that it is this domino effect. And it's this compounding, just as we see those who are better off able to weather the storm because of the cushion that they have. At the same time, those at the other end have this compounding effect when one thing goes wrong, that it can just spiral. We had a wonderful opportunity just last week to meet with one of our incredible state legislators here in Massachusetts, State Senator Liz Miranda, who represents many of the families who are in our portfolio. All of the families who reside in one of our shelter units. One of the many things we do is provide housing to the family emergency shelter system here in the Commonwealth. All of our families are enrolled in some sort of economic mobility coaching program. They are working with our coaches to strategize around their goals, what they're trying to accomplish, how to eliminate barriers when they come up, how to deal with the cliff effect, that whole, if I get more opportunity, more income, I'm going to lose something else. It's a very difficult, my mother used to always say, and she says it to this day, the hardest job she ever had was being poor. Just the hardest job she ever had. All of the things you have to navigate, all of the ways that dealing with entities, government agencies can be not just destabilizing, but dehumanizing. It's really unfortunate, and we need change not just at the federal level. We need to do more at the state and local level, but certainly this notion of sharing risk at the federal level would do so much in terms of the basic needs piece of this. We need to make sure that families are not choosing between childcare and important medicine, or paying their rent, or keeping their lights or their heat on. But that is what is happening with too many families, particularly here in Massachusetts. We have great wealth here in the Commonwealth, and more people are finding themselves not able to make their basic needs.
Thank you so much for that, because I think it puts into stark relief some of the layered vulnerabilities that many of our underserved communities experience. And so a question for Professor McCoy would be, how would you see our policies and structures, particularly the federal system, navigating that, navigating the fact that many of our families are dealing with layered vulnerabilities, and so for many the risk that they have is not just economic, it's also legal, it's social, it's existential, it's whether they're going to be deported the next day, et cetera, et cetera.
Right. So, as you know, my book focuses really on financial risks, and my major proposal, which is to have expanded social insurance, is really focused on providing more financial resources. The legal risk that many families face is not well suited for social insurance. We need to address that in different ways. But it is so real, and it very much shapes the daily decisions of many families. Let me give you an example. I have a wonderful law professor colleague at UC Irvine, and she studies the economic decisions of single mothers who sometimes have to be on welfare and other times cycle off welfare. What she found in her research is that the welfare system sends these mixed messages by telling welfare recipients, if you work, you will be disqualified for welfare. And yet, the welfare check is not enough to live on. It is way below poverty level. And so it puts these women in a very precarious situation where they probably need to work under the table just to get some cash flow to come in so they can put food on the table for their children. But it puts them in danger not only of losing their welfare, but sometimes of criminal prosecution for welfare fraud. And all they're trying to do is just make it through the end of the month and make sure that their kids can survive. So we really need to think in this country as we design programs to provide constructive incentives to work. These are mothers who want to work, and they are working. Let's support them. Let's make that a constructive endeavor instead of one that generates legal risk for them.
One of the things, if you don't mind, Amanda, jumping in, that I found really interesting in the book And it's an age-old argument about who is worthy, who's lazy, who's working, who's should have access to benefits, who actually gets access to benefits. And one of the things that you pointed out, and I think it's particularly important in this discussion, is all of the ways that those are up at the upper levels of income get some sort of tax break, some sort of incentive to save, some sort of support along the way. And while others who are kind of left out there to fend for themselves are not getting that same kind of support. There's a narrative often about who is working hard and worthy of a helping hand, and who is looking for a handout. And we know that this often falls on racial lines. We also know that women often bear the brunt of the burden regardless of race. I'm wondering if you would share more about your thinking. I found it very fascinating. I don't know if it was chapter 5. You also talked about savings.
Yes.
And who had a straighter path to savings and where there were these obstacles for others. And as I think about the work at EMPath, I could see how that plays out.
The savings topic is so interesting because when you look at federal policy showers affluent wage earners, affluent workers with huge tax subsidies for savings, for 401k plans, for 529 college savings plans. Meanwhile, the lower, maybe 40% or so of the income spectrum in this country is in a zero tax bracket. So they're not going to get any of those subsidies at all. A lot of times when there are discussions about expanding social insurance, people will say, well, that would be unfairly subsidizing lower income people. And I want to turn the tables on that rhetoric and say, look, we've made a decision in this country about who to subsidize, and it's the richest people.
Exactly.
It's the richest people, and that's a story about power.
Yep. And the same is true with big corporations. So there's all this talk about who is on the welfare rolls, for example. Meanwhile, lots of tax credits, big subsidies go to big corporations, whether Google, whether McDonald's, you name it. Yet, that poor women in particular with children somehow are the boogeyman in all of this. It's unfortunate, but hopefully we will have a chance to continue to do important work to change the tide, and we do have an opportunity this fall, and I have a shameless plug. There's an opportunity right at the end of March. Our Disrupting Poverty Conference, it's a national conference, we hold it right here in Boston, at the other Boston University. The other school was at Boston University. But it's March 23rd through the 26th. We certainly would love to have folks. More information at the end. We've got a QR code if you're interested in learning more. But this is bringing together researchers, philanthropists, practitioners, policymakers, community leaders from all across the country, looking at guaranteed income, looking at the benefits cliff, looking at how can we help families continue to climb despite the ugly rhetoric coming out of Washington, D.C. So if you can join us at the end of March, we'll be down the road at the other school. All right.
Could I add something about the benefits cliff? It's so interesting you raised that. So something I didn't realize till I researched the book is that we have at least 3 programs in this country that provide many families with important benefits. But at the very bottom of the income spectrum, for the families that make the least, they don't qualify because they don't make enough money. So the earned income tax credit is one. The child tax credit is another. So there are a good number of families with children who don't get these tax credits because they don't make enough money. They are too low wage. And then unemployment insurance has the same problem. So in a lot of ways, even those benefits, we steer more to middle income families.
Yep. And those did so much when the expansion of those tax
Yes.
credits to really address child poverty. We saw the numbers go in the right direction, and as soon as they pulled back, we saw it dip again. So we know what works if we're just willing to invest in it.
What Mayor Janey is referring to is, interestingly, during COVID, Congress, this is the first Trump administration, it's fascinating. Congress took these programs, all three of them, and made them much more generous so that temporarily they did cover the poorest families. And we way expanded unemployment insurance as well. But those changes were temporary, and they have now expired. But we did it before. We can do it again. And interestingly, when those programs were temporarily expanded, it was both Republicans and Democrats voting to expand them. And so one of the things I think about in the book is it even realistic to think about expanding social safety nets? And there are times when we can cross the aisle and get bipartisan support for doing this.
So that's, when you have a really good fireside chat or a panel, the moderator doesn't even have to be here. And so like, in my effort to be like Homer Simpson, just kind of like backing into the bush, I'm going to actually open up the floor for questions. Because I know we have many faculty members and also students here who are eager to ask questions of both Mayor Janey and Professor McCoy. So I'm going to cede my microphone, actually.
Sorry, we do ask you to wait for the microphone so that our Zoom participants can hear the questions.
Yes, thank you. I had every confidence I could follow.
That was on.
Yeah, we can hear it.
Yeah.
Yes, right. Okay, so I think my question is for both of you in different ways. It's actually two parts. The first is, to the extent we are thinking about social insurance and risk sharing as a particular sort of set of problems within a wide suite of problems. The two questions I had is, for a focus at the federal level, Professor McCoy, is probably a little more for you, do you see it more as an expansion of existing programs that would be the best place to start? That might be both politically strategic question as well as perhaps just a design question. Or is it something new and additional? And then the second question is, you were very clear about why it's a federal issue from your perspective. But do you see examples or ways or places in which cities and states have at all been successful on the risk sharing? That they have other kinds of ways in which they can engage with these concerns, but on the sort of risk sharing social insurance, we've seen sort of examples at a lower level that have been successful.
And Diane, remind me the first part of your question. I'm sorry.
Oh, the first part was, once we're at the federal level, are we thinking first line of attack, expand and redesign existing, or just new, all in new?
Right. My approach is a more incremental approach, which is that we actually have a lot of these social insurance programs in place, but a lot of them are really showing their age. I think it's a lot easier to build a political coalition to take the existing programs and expand them. The danger of that is that some of them have baked in some very serious problems. So for example, both Social Security and unemployment insurance had a history of racial discrimination that is baked into the design of those programs. And so there's a risk of perpetuating that without some radical redesign of some of their moving parts. But ultimately, we do have a lot of programs to build on. As for state and local, what I forgot to say is that state and local governments have been real engines of innovation in these areas. Even more important these days, as so many federal programs are being mothballed. I'm going to say mothballed rather than discontinued. But for example, state and local governments have been really innovative in coming up with different retirement savings vehicles for low-wage workers. And apparently, last night, President Trump actually called for adopting that at the federal level. So, we'll see what happens. The other thing that's technically not a risk-sharing program, but it's really important to my proposals, is raising the minimum wage. The federal minimum wage has been stuck at $7.25 an hour. I think it's that low. Yeah, way too low since 2009. But states, over half the states have raised their state minimum wages to as high as $17 an hour. And that, I think, will create the pressure eventually for the federal government to adopt it nationwide.
And I'll just quickly jump in to say, to affirm that local municipalities and states have a lot of power and opportunity, maybe not so much on the grander scale of social insurance, but in terms of affordability in their cities and their states. In the city of Boston, for example, there is a living wage ordinance that Mayor Walsh implemented when he was mayor. And so now anyone who is doing business with the city has to pay those workers at least that living wage. And that's a good standard for other private companies to look to as well. You look at the housing market, there is something to be done there around building. I haven't seen a lot of building happening in my city as of late, but the more we get on the supply side of things, and with the supply that we already have, there are still levers around affordability there. Is there an opportunity for better coordination around childcare, for example? A local municipality has the opportunity to expand access to early care through your public schools. And so there are a lot of levers that a city or a state could do to help around affordability and make sure that families have the tools, the resource, and the ability to climb the economic ladder.
Hi, thank you so much for this. I just had a real follow-up question to that. Could you just talk a little bit more about what states and localities, or maybe even states and localities are not always going to work together on these issues, but what they could do for the framing of the narrative such that the political will to do the things that you have in the book could actually happen at the federal level? Because it seems like one of the big problems is that the narrative about affordability is sort of not there at the federal level. And what role could localities and states play in helping to change that narrative?
May?
Well, I'll jump in. If folks have been following the politics in Boston as of late, you've seen perhaps how a local mayor, and this is the current mayor, Mayor Wu, has stood up to the federal government and has tried to change the narrative around, or reinforce this narrative in Boston that we're fighters, that we're going to fight back on all of the policies that you were bringing to our city. I don't know, while I think people in Boston feel proud of that, I don't know that it's doing enough to change what is happening in DC. We don't live in a bubble anywhere in this country. What impacts one community is going to somehow indirectly impact another. So I think there's still much more work to do. Fortunately, we have a superstar congressional delegation, and my representative, Ayanna Pressley, is making the case every single day. But oftentimes, people are really fighting against strong winds that are going the other way. That being said, we have to stay encouraged and keep fighting. There is work, still a lot of work an opportunity to kind of get what we need done, but we are far from changing the narrative. I would suggest, though, that the midterms is an opportunity, and so that is right before us, and if we can change the seats in the House and the Senate, perhaps we will see more of what we need coming out of D.C.
There's an indirect way that voices from the ground can affect Washington. And I think a really nice example is what recently happened with Obamacare premiums. So up through December 31st last year, the federal government heavily subsidized premiums for Obamacare health policies. And this helped roughly 25 million people. So that's a lot of people. But last summer, Congress changed that. It passed the One Big Beautiful Bill Act. It did not address those subsidies, and the subsidies vanished on January 1st this year. What that has meant is that the average family's Obamacare premium has gone up by often $1,000 a month. We started getting congressional delegations and mayors in blue states and in blue cities pointing out the problem and calling on Congress to act. Congress has not yet acted, but finally the message is getting through to Republican members of Congress that their constituents are getting hit really, really hard by this. And they're really angry about it. So Marjorie Taylor Greene, one of the reasons that she became disaffected with the White House was because her constituents' Obamacare premiums skyrocketed overnight. So if we can highlight these things that are really hitting families in the pocketbook, we then have Republican members of Congress who start getting scared about their re-election prospects.
Yeah. And as you're queuing up the next question, if there's time for one, I love how you mentioned that people have a lot of power. One of the things we did last year was bring folks to Washington, D.C. EMPath brought a number of organizations from all over the country to meet up in Washington to have these very conversations with congressional leaders all over the country. And we brought about 10 parent advocates right from Boston with us as well. So important. And many folks think that Obamacare premiums are going up intentionally as an effort to kill it. That's what they've been trying to do all along. I think there's a question.
Thank you, Pat. Hello there. I'm Professor Thompson at the law school. So I have two questions. One is, what you talked about in part was that this divide between wealthier people in our society getting government support, welfare, whatever you want to call it, and that seemed as normal. But if it's people who are poorer, it seemed as some illegitimate handout. Sometimes there's a problem among people who are similarly situated economically. And so I remember when I was in Wisconsin, and Scott Walker was the governor, and he was trying to gut the city. And interestingly enough, a lot of white Wisconsinites who actually were impacted economically supported Walker. And I was reading some social science literature about this. And disproportionately, those families, even though objectively they were poor, they didn't self-identify as poor. They identified as being wealthier. So they're like, these cuts are not going to affect us. It's primarily going to affect the black poor. And that led to this kind of divide and conquer strategy, which Walker successfully was able to capitalize on. So the question number one is, how do you deal with those dynamics, which is a little more complicated, or maybe not that. The second, I just wanted to give you another example. I don't know. So in terms of one of the most generous tax breaks in the entire IRS code is for folks who place their land in a conservation easement. They get this incredibly generous tax deduction. The problem with it is that it assumes it's only available to you if you make substantial income. There are similarly situated, or there are other landowners who we call are land rich but cash poor, who the tax deduction means nothing to them, right? So if they put their land under a conservation easement, all it does is devalue their land in terms of, if it's going to be a generational resource. And I remember, so I kind of brought that up to people, well, why couldn't we have a tax credit for those? And the answer I've gotten is like, well, we can't trust the valuations. So I'm like, when it's wealthier properties, it seems like you're totally trusting the valuations. And where does the valuation all of a sudden become uncertain just because the people who leave landowners involved are not wealthy? Like, it's not clear to me. But anyway, that's often the answer I've gotten.
I'll jump in. I'll defer a lot of the second part to the professor. But it's interesting, the first part of your question, I think, is not unique to Wisconsin. We saw it with the Poor People's Campaign. After King was assassinated, we saw it in Reconstruction. This attempt to unify and show commonality between poor whites and the plight of African Americans has been a strategy for unification, and it also has been, to keep those groups apart, a strategy for division, and at least I'm not like them. So maybe I'm a poor white, but at least I'm not that. Has always been the case, and so we just saw it play out again in this last presidential race, where folks knew they had a playbook called Project 2025 of all of the things that they wanted to do, and they put it out there, and no one believed that it would impact them. And so in the early months, I remember a year ago, last February, last March, looking at these town halls, Republican town halls, with individuals who were extremely angry about what was happening, not realizing, they thought it was going to be those folks over there who were going to get it. Now, sadly and tragically, we have seen ICE agents who have killed American citizens all across this country. It's happening. We see it playing out in Minnesota. And these are white individuals who thought they didn't have to worry about ICE, sadly. We are not going to get anywhere if we keep these divisions. If we are okay with a segment of our population, whether poor, whether black, whether immigrant, whether queer, whatever the label, not getting what everyone else can get access to, I don't see how we call that a democracy. I don't see how we call that, you mentioned the common good in your opening statement. If we care about the public good, like public education, whether we have kids in a school system or not, we all have to care about whether these children are getting educated. If not, who is going to pay into the social insurance that then pays for all of us to enjoy some level of security? The other piece around land had to do with some risk, and there was, risk has always been used as a way to deny certain people of opportunity, but I will defer the land question to you, Professor, or to someone else at the university. But thank you for that observation and question.
Thomas, I think your observation on the valuation question is spot on, that if we trust valuations for certain taxpayers' deductions, then why should they be less trustworthy if we change to a tax credit system? It makes no sense to me. And the valuations are generated by licensed appraisers. So it, as you say, it's a matter of rhetoric. I do wonder, I think this divide and conquer strategy is so cynical and is so pervasive, but I also wonder if sometimes people like Scott Brown simply run out of a landing strip, because even the poor white people at some point realize that they're being exploited, and they finally come around and at least demand economic justice. It may not affect who they vote for president, but it may affect who they vote for Congress. And so there may be other political channels where, as they become soured on the economy and on promises that were not fulfilled to them, that they can generate pressure for political reform.
So I wanted to thank all of you for participating in this Thursday chat today. But most of all, of course, I want to recognize both of our wonderful participants here. Professor McCoy, thank you for writing this. I want to take the opportunity to hold up the book as many times as I can, sharing risk. And also, Mayor Janey, for the incredible work you're doing at EMPath. And also for your leadership of Boston through some pretty tough times. You continue to be a beacon for us, and you continue to champion equity in all of your work and to show us how we might do that as well. So on the theme of acting and doing not acting, I think for a lot of students, we kind of feel like we are performing lawyering right now. That's why we have all these things like imposter syndrome, right, where we don't feel like we're performing correctly. But nonetheless, it doesn't undermine the theory that we are performing. And I hope what this conversation allows you to do is to think about what it means to actually do. And we have opened up a world of possibilities between the structural reforms that Professor McCoy talks about and the more community and personal reforms that Mayor Janey talks about, a world of ways in which we can all do. And so I challenge you to do that. And I thank you very much for joining us today, and look forward to seeing you on March 11th when we talk about the ways in which state and localities have stepped in to the breach to think about how to do health and safety differently now that the federal government has mothballed those programs. Thank you all.
Thank you.